All right. So, can I pick up where we left off? So, there's some stuff we didn't quite get to at the end of last week. I'll probably touch on that at the end of class. It's not the most important. In the quiz, I put like a question at the end that was worth 0 points. That was kind of related to what we didn't quite cover. So you have an example of what a question would look like. It's a little bit. It's material that's kind of disjoint from what we were talking about last week a little bit anyways. So it's kind of self-contained. So we'll look at that at the end of class. But today we'll kind of start with module 3. So that module 3 reading was due when? The end of last night, right? What was also due at the end of last night? Module 2 quiz, right? So this is going to be recurring every single week. So this week, after Thursday's class, you'll see module 3 quiz and module 4 reading. Okay. So we're moving quick. Right, we're already through the first 2 weeks. We've got really 2 more weeks of material, and then we'll be at that first exam week. Okay, so things move quick. Right, this is why falling behind. You want to make sure you're keeping active in this class. Another thing that we had that's due at the end of the day. Actually, when do I have this set? Go back to the home page here. We scroll down. Where's that? That first pack back assignment, right? So that's not due until the end of next week. We've got quite a while to work on that. It's really kind of related to what we talked about last week. Although some of the things we talked about this week, maybe you could kind of work into the discussions. But this was that platform where you'll have my initial kind of guidepost. I think I didn't pull it open. So here we'll go. Pack back. There we go. Now you can go to packback.co, the actual site, and kind of sign in that way. We can kind of see the only discussion we have open right now, kind of this first one. So it's got my initial guidepost. Like I said, a lot of related to kind of thinking about productivity, the trade-offs that exist between producing things in an economy. You'll kind of post your initial response using this ask a question button. So we kind of covered this last class. Once you post your initial response, also trying, like I said, writing it in a way where, yes, you're making some statements, giving your opinion. We're kind of trying to end it with questions so that someone can respond to it, or, this is what I think about it, but maybe what about this, right? Or this is how I think this issue could be resolved, but what if this happened, right? Kind of adding in some prompts at the end, allowing then for everyone to respond to 2 other individuals' posts. And then I'll kind of look at those. I might bring in some of the ones that I like the best, talk about them in class. So we have that kind of going on at the same thing. Right now, we don't have another reading or a quiz, so it might be a good time to work on that today, tomorrow, before we kind of have these other assignments start to pop up. So do you have a question? Not technically. You only need to do 2. So there's no extra points for doing more than 2, but if you want to. Yeah, there's no limit on, yeah. Some of them will be more popular than others in terms of, some of us are still getting used to this, might just write one that's easier to respond to than others, yeah. But there's no points, if somebody doesn't respond to yours as much, it's not going to count against you. Or if they respond a lot, it's not going to count additionally. Is that what you're asking? Yeah. Any other questions before we get going here today? The herd's getting a little thin here in the 8 a.m. But we'll kind of get started here. So dead air. So we'll kind of start with these skeleton slides. I've got a complete version of them. We'll kind of fill some things in that might not be there. But we're going to transition, slightly different topic. Yeah. Oh, really? Well, why would that be? The slides are locked. Try this. I don't want you to see this one yet. I'm in the right class, right? Yeah. Make sure that they're. Oh, that's why. There's only about 50 places I have to unlock everything. All right. Now let's see. Hopefully, you pull them up now. Yes, no. Yes, okay. Thank you for letting me know that. I forget that I don't just have to publish. Although I feel like it should default if I publish it on the homepage just to publish it when they're in the files. I just put them up in the files just in case you want to kind of access them later. This is how I like to organize them, but you know, they're organized a little bit different in the files tab. So we've got not only the slides, I've kind of got the outline of the learning objectives that we'll try to cover this week, as well as the practice problems that would exist, you know, for studying for this week's quiz. Okay. Oh, before we get going, I think CL sessions went pretty well, hopefully. I think I've heard from a couple, there's maybe a couple hiccups. I kind of talked to the leaders a little bit, kind of making sure things will go a little bit more smoothly this week. But I think I had like about 200 people across my 2 sections. So it's about a third of you at least showed up to one of them. That's good on you. That's higher than I usually see. So those, like I said, I can't reiterate enough. If you're wanting some more one-on-one, or you're wanting to see problems work through, just more problems, get you ready for the quiz and eventually get you ready for the exam. Those CL sessions are a good place to kind of go to. I had some questions and maybe I haven't, sometimes I second guess myself, but pretty sure that I kind of made it aware. There's a summary file under the files tab that kind of has the days, times, and locations. I also updated, and I just moved the syllabus out of week 1 just so it's a little bit easier to find. But I also added in after the first week, once I had those locations established, they kind of are here in the syllabus as well. And I think if I even go back to that first week of slides, I updated one of the collaborative learning slides to kind of include those. So you've got, you know, multiple places where those locations and times are, you know, made known to you. But those will pick up back again this Thursday and this Sunday. Okay. Any questions for me before we jump into material here? Yeah.
How was the extra credit you added on?
Well, at the very end, right? It has to be worked out at 0 points. I can't add it in until the end. After we get a few of them established, I'll put up like a, what's the word? Like a figure, it's just there. It's not counting towards your grade, but you can kind of see it, so you can kind of see what your running total is. I may not update this every single week. I may only update it every every exam, so you kind of see where you're at. I'll try to do a little bit quicker so you can kind of make sure that your attendance is getting reported. In fact, for Thursday's class, I'll update it from that first week so you can kind of see what I'm talking about. It's like a placeholder. There's the word. I have a placeholder that kind of shows you kind of what your current attendance points would be. And none for you because your sheet's name. So, sorry, Vic. Any other questions before we dive into it here? Okay. All right, so we'll go to module 3 here. Kind of switching gears a little bit from what we talked about last week, thinking about economies as a whole. We're going to look more now at like individual markets. Okay. So we're going to think about a market really is just saying we're looking at one specific product and the buyers and sellers that exist for that product. So this could be something as stupid as Sharpie markers, right? Who is buying them? Who is producing them? Okay? You could have this be things like, you know, I don't know, different television programs, right? There's consumers and there's producers of those programs. So we're really looking at a variety of different goods. As long as there's buyers and sellers, we can understand how markets are gonna work basically, and how these two groups will interact. So we're gonna start out kind of assuming we have these perfectly competitive markets, so that there's a lot of sellers and there's a lot of producers of this good. So this is not situations where, like, you know, if I want to, I don't know, what's a good example of if I want to get electricity in Bloomington, there's only one provider. That is not a perfectly competitive market, right? I need many suppliers or many producers of the good. That's the type of markets we're thinking about. Also, if I'm thinking about someone who's trying to get like a government contract for defense or something like that, well, there's only one buyer. Those markets aren't as popular, but they do exist. We're thinking about perfectly competitive markets, lots of buyers, lots of sellers. Nobody has any influence over the price, right? This, you know, if it helps to think about like clothing, things like that, right? I can't start charging $100 for just a regular blue sweatshirt, right? Unless I don't know, build some brand recognition or something. But like, you know, if you go to Walmart, they can't charge $100 because, you know, well, I'm just going to buy a blue sweatshirt for $100. I'll go to someone else who's going to sell it to me for much less, right? And, you know, so this is the idea that buyers and sellers are going to be price takers. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we kind of progress. Eventually, we'll start talking about what non-perfectly competitive markets look like. But for now, we're assuming they're perfectly competitive. Okay. So we've got two sides of this, right? We've got people who are buying a product and people who are selling it. We'll first start focusing on who's buying it or demand, right? So when we think about quantity demanded, this is going to be how much an individual consumer, someone buying a good, would be willing to pay, right? So, or sorry, this isn't how much they're willing to pay. It's how much they're willing to buy at a certain price, okay? So the quantity demanded would be how much someone's willing to buy at a specific price, okay? So if I charge you $50 for a pair of Nikes, are you going to buy it or not? Are you willing to purchase that? If you are, you're buy one pair of shoes, your quantity demanded would be one. If you're willing to buy two pairs of shoes at that price, your quantity demanded would be two, so on and so forth, right? So the law of demand tells us, and this isn't like breaking news, right? If the price of something goes up, in general, what are you going to do? Buy less of it, right? So we have this relationship between price and quantity demanded that says as price goes up, quantity demanded is going to go down or vice versa, right? There's this inverse relationship, okay? So we have this inverse relationship that exists. It's fairly intuitive. I'm using arrows here, and everything we'll draw in this class, we're going to assume this relationship is linear. It makes the math easier. Once like intermediate micro, we start to think about, well, what if these demand curves have some actual curvature to them, and they're not just these nice linear lines. But for now, we're going to assume everything's linear. Makes the math, everything we're drawing, a lot easier to do, okay? So what's really kind of driving this law of demand? When the price of something goes up, right? Why would you maybe buy less of it? So if all of a sudden Nike's trying to charge you $400 for a pair of shoes, what might you do? Not buy a pair of Nikes, but buy Adidas, some other, right? What do? You substitute away to basically a very similar product, the shoe, right? It's the same market, to someone who's charging a lower price. So if we can substitute between goods, right, that's going to cause some of this inverse relationship. When companies drive up the price, maybe instead of buying tennis shoes, I start to buy more, I don't know, Crocs or sandals or what's a slightly different product, right? The income effect also drives this. If, you know, the price of something gets astronomically high, let's say you guys are kind of on a fixed income, why don't you go out and buy a house right now? Most of you probably don't have enough income, right? When the price of something gets high enough, people start to buy less because we don't have enough money. So we have this income and substitution effect that are really going to be driving this law of demand, okay? As prices go up, I'm going to buy less because I'm going to start to substitute away to cheaper goods. But also as the price goes up, even if I really need this good or I really want it, I can't afford it, right? I might have to buy less of it, okay? So that's kind of just setting up us thinking about this demand. We're now going to start to make it a little bit more mathematical and thinking about what we call a demand schedule, right? So even though we know the direction of the relationship, right, we might want to know, well, at different prices, exactly how much is going to be purchased. If I'm a company, I'm really interested in this, right? If I charge different prices, how much are you going to be willing to buy? Okay? So we'll look at something like, right, a demand schedule where, if I move this, we'll have a bunch of different prices. And here, this isn't like a complete demand schedule because obviously I don't have to charge just $1, $2, $3 for this good. I could charge $2.33. You know, you think about like an actual demand schedule could be every single possible price. We're just going to summarize this a little bit, thinking about a smaller set. The same rules would apply if I was thinking about going from charging 0 to 0.1, you know, 1 cent, 2 cent, 3 cent, etc. So we're going to have these different prices, and at these different prices, how much is this one consumer willing to buy? So for this drink, right, orange mocha frappuccinos, if the price was completely free, you might think, well, I would take all of them, right? Well, okay, what we talked about, I mean, at some point, even if the price is 0, if I drink more than 12 of these, what might happen to the marginal benefit that I get? We said, as I consume more of something, the marginal benefit is generally doing what? Decreasing. At some point, if I drink 12 frappuccinos, marginal benefit might be, yeah, the marginal cost is 0. And less than that, it means it's negative, right? I'm getting sick, right? So even if the price is 0, there is still some limit at how much consumers want to buy, okay? So we'll start out at this lowest possible price of 0. As we increase the price, given this person's income and given the other substitutes that exist, what's going to happen? Well, as I increase the price, they start to buy, or they're willing to buy less and less. So our demand schedule kind of shows that to us. At what price would they be willing to no longer buy this good, even 1 unit? Price of $6. So we have this different combination of prices and quantity demanded of a product. This is essentially going to be a table version of what we'll call the demand curve. Right? So if I were to take each one of these points, and just think about, okay, didn't want blue. Well, we'll find a black marker later. If I were to then kind of graph out these different combinations of prices and quantities, if I had that slide in front of me, I think it was when the price was $6, they bought 0. When the price was $5, they bought 2. When the price was $4, they bought 4. I would basically just plot all of those points. What was the last one? 12. And kind of think about my demand curve would just be connecting all of those points that I saw on my demand schedule. So even if the demand schedule isn't complete, right? I only have what, 7, I think, points in that table. My demand curve, because we're keeping it linear for the sake of this class, I can really tell you what the price would have to be for me to buy any number of goods here. 2.5, 2.3, or whatever I'm interested in. And we'll kind of go through how I would do that in a second using an equation. But for now, we're just thinking about if I had this demand schedule, I could plot these different points, connect them all, and that curve, once again, we're gonna have a linear curve, but that would represent what we call the demand curve, right? It shows all the different combinations of prices and quantity demanded for this one individual consumer, okay? Notice it's downward sloping, right? So I've got a downward sloping demand curve. And I want to jump a gun here. Well, I'll hold off a little bit. So any questions on this before we keep moving? So I am gonna go a little bit ahead of kind of where we're at in the slides, but I think it makes sense since we have this visual. So you can kind of think about, if I was charging $6 here, I said people would not be willing to buy any, right? I think if we do the math, the price at which the very first quantity demanded will exist, or the first drink would be purchased, would be at $5.50. So what does that mean? That means any price that was above $5.50, the person was not willing to buy that first good, that first unit of that Frappuccino. Right? So what would the price reflect to consumers? If you buy something, to you, it is a cost or benefit? Cost, right? To a consumer, the price is essentially the marginal cost, right? So if the marginal cost is above $5.50 and the person's not willing to buy any of that good, that must mean what? Well, when did we say last class people choose to do something? Whether or not this is economies, the same thing applies to individuals. Whenever that marginal benefit is greater than or equal to my marginal cost. So if I'm not buying that very first drink, whenever that price is above $5.50, as soon as it hits $5.50, I see people buy that very first unit. That must mean their marginal benefit would be equal to what? What would be the very first value they're willing to buy that as soon as the marginal benefit is equal to that marginal cost, right? So greater than or equal to. So we know that the demand curve essentially is telling us this is the lowest possible price at which the person is willing to buy the first unit. Well, we know that as I have more of something, my marginal benefit goes down. So if I keep the price at $5.50, would I buy the second unit? Well, if the first one, I kind of valued at $5.50, I know the second one I'm gonna value at something lower. So if I keep the price at $5.50 for that second unit, would I be willing to buy it? No, right? So we can think about demand tells us marginal benefit. The prices that we're looking at tell us our marginal cost. So what would have to happen in order to incentivize the consumer to buy the second good? I can't charge $5.50. I have to lower the price. Right? So this demand curve essentially reflects to us the consumer's marginal benefit. So if we're drawing these out, a lot of the times when I write in demand, I'll also write demand is equal to the marginal benefit of the consumer. Right? And then we know the decision of the consumer is based off of, is my marginal benefit represented by this demand curve, is it above or below the marginal cost, which for the consumer is simply the price that's being set. Okay. Jumping the gun a little bit there, but I think it's worth it kind of introducing it here before we go a little more in depth later. Any questions on this idea before we keep moving? So the main takeaway I want you to have here is demand represents the marginal benefit of each one of these different quantity demanded, right? Or each different unit, right? The first unit, the second, the third, etc. Okay. All right. So we had our demand schedule. I did a little bit of an aside here. All right, we can just plot all of those points, be a little bit more complete than I was when I was just plotting like 2 or 3 of them. But if I plotted all these points, I've now got my demand curve.
So in last class, you said that where marginal benefit decreases because the consumer needs get satisfied as they consume more and right.
Mhm.
And then like demand is represents the marginal benefit. So is the demand falling because of the price or because the needs are being satisfied?
So the demand is falling because I'm willing to pay a lower price. Think about it this way. If I go into a store and I really want something to drink, right? I want a coffee. I might go to Starbucks. I might be willing to pay, God only knows how much. I mean, they're whatever, $7, right? To get that first one. Am I going to pay $7 to get 2 drinks? Well, the first one I was willing to pay $7 because like I wanted coffee. I'm tired. I need caffeine, right? And I like coffee. Maybe I want 2 this morning, but that second one doesn't bring me near as much value as the first. So I'm not willing to pay near as much. Now, if they run a deal where it's buy one, get one free, or buy one, get one half off, right? They lower the price of that second unit. What might I choose to do that morning? Get 2. But that's only because they're offering me a lower price on that second unit. They know I'm not willing to pay as much for that second unit as I was for the first. So that reason, the fact that I'm willing to pay less and less to have more and more of this product, that's why our demand curve is downward sloping, right? The marginal benefit of each additional unit is going to be falling. Is that what you were getting at? Yeah. Any other questions on this before we keep moving here? Yeah.
Just for one individual rather than like.
So right now we're just thinking about the individual. The same kind of concepts will apply to the market, but we'll get there. Walk before we can run. We'll just think about the individual first, and then we'll eventually get to the market. Yep. Any other questions at this point? Okay. Let me spend my time here. All right. So I'll put all this up here, but I'm going to come back to it. So if I were just to have any linear line that looked like this, so let's say I was doing basic math class and I've got y and x. What would you usually write? What would the form of this line be? Y is equal to, I think the way that it usually teaches is like mx plus b, right? It does, m and b are kind of trivial here. What is b? Our intercept. What would m be? Slope. So for us, right, we've got price and quantity. So what is our y? Price. What is our x? Quantity, right? Or quantity demanded, right? So in general, I'll write it out a little bit different, right? Our y value or variable is a function of our x variable. Our intercept is A, and then our slope is B, right? Just to kind of keep it, but trying to make that connection to like a more mathematical kind of representation. So if I'm looking at this curve, what is my intercept? Or what would A be? Yeah, where does it start out? At what would I have a quantity demanded of 0? Or sorry. Yeah, right? 6 here, right? Now, as I buy more and more, what's the slope of this line? Well, I would need kind of 2 points here, but if I have the 2 extremes, I can always use those. Just like for our production possibilities curve. How do I find the slope of a line? The change in Y over change in X, which now is going to be the change in price over the change in quantity. What's the change in price? I'm going from now 6 to 0, so -6. What was quantity changing by? 12, so -1/2, oops, sorry, would be the slope of my linear demand curve. So we've got this nice linear demand curve. We can always find the intercept. This would be the price at which 0 is demanded, right? The quantity demand is equal to 0. Now, the slope, we calculate just like we would any slope, right? Change in Y over change in X, which now our Y and X is change in price over the change in quantity. Now, notice here, unlike the production possibilities curve, when we're always talking about costs, we kind of ignore the negative sign. Here, the negative sign is important because it reflects to us the relationship that exists between price and quantity demanded. I said that as the price goes up, people buy less. Another way of saying that is, as that X value goes up, so as people buy more and more, what has to be happening to the price in order for us to see them buy more? The price would have to be falling. So what is going to be the slope of our demand curve? It's always going to be negative or downward sloping. So our demand curve should always have a negative slope, right? This relationship between price and the amount that someone's buying, it's inverse, right? So I'm always going to have a negative slope for my demand curve, okay? Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. So we actually kind of already talked through this, right, a little bit. But the demand curve reflects to us, we said already, the marginal benefit of the consumer, right? The amount that I'm willing to pay, well, I'm only willing to buy something as long as that marginal benefit is greater than or equal to the price, right? So when those are equal, right, as soon as that price gets low enough to where it's equal to the marginal benefit, I'll buy that unit. So if we looked at this, right, how could I find the marginal benefit of different units here? So if I wanted the marginal benefit of the first, second, third, what would I do? Well, if I go back, right, we already had the intercept and the slope for our demand curve. So once we have this equation, right, once I have that demand equation, I can start to think of, this switches over for me, right? And just to be clear, sorry, because we talked about it, but we had our intercept was 6, our slope was -1/2. So when I'm thinking about my demand equation, my intercept was 6, my slope was -1/2. So what this price represents, we said as soon as the price hits my marginal benefit, I'm willing to buy that product. So really the price is telling me the marginal benefit of these different units. So even though our demand curve, right, is the relationship between price and quantity, what that price represents to us was the very first price at which the consumer was willing to buy that good. So we know the very first price at which they're willing to buy that. If you think about it here, let's say I know that someone's going to buy something as long as the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. If my marginal benefit was 6, right? If the marginal cost or the price was 8, would I buy that first unit? No, 8 is not, less than or equal to 6. What if they lowered the price to 7? No. What about 650? No. So what's the first price at which they'd be willing to buy it? As soon as that price is equal to their marginal benefit. So the price on the demand curve, when we're thinking about kind of the equation, that price really reflects to us the first price that would be equal to the consumer's marginal benefit. So it also tells us the consumer's marginal benefit. So if I wanted, for example, to know the marginal benefit of the, no, I forget which values I said the first, second, and third. So what if I wanted the marginal benefit of the very first kind of drink? Well, I would just plug a 1 into here. I would get what? 6 minus 1/2 times 1 is equal to 550. What if I wanted, so that's the marginal benefit of the first unit. What if I wanted the marginal benefit of the second unit? Well, there I'm just plugging in a 2 into the quantity. Now, my demand equation would tell me that the marginal benefit of that second unit would be equal to $5. And I can kind of continue to plug in different quantities, and I can find the marginal benefit of any quantity I'm interested in. Even if I want to know what about 1.5 drinks, right? Even though it's kind of goofy in the context of this example, maybe it's not if I'm thinking about like I'm buying huge shipment orders and I'm buying like half a pallet of something if I'm, you know, consumer or whatever it is. Or if I'm thinking about like fluid ounces that I'm buying, maybe I would want to buy half an ounce or something like that. So that price from our demand equation is also going to reflect to us the marginal benefit of the consumers to all those different quantities. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. All right. I think if there's anything else I wanted to say here, I don't think so. So we'll go back to the slides. Oops. Kind of already talked about how we find those marginal benefits, right, of different quantities. So one thing that I'll kind of reference throughout the semester is that this demand curve, because that price also reflects marginal benefits, it's really telling us the consumer's marginal benefit. Well, what does that represent? Well, that's how much they're willing and able to pay, right? So it kind of factors in, this is how much I'm going to value by buying this good and whether or not I can actually buy it, right? So kind of given my income, am I willing and able to purchase this good at this specific price? Okay. And we've already talked about kind of quite a bit already, but the fact that as we buy more of something, this marginal benefit is going to be declining. Hopefully we can kind of see from that equation, as long as that slope is negative, as long as that slope is negative, as I plug in higher 1 to 2, higher and higher quantities, that marginal benefit is going to be declining. All right, that'll kind of play out with the mathematics as well. Okay. So we've got this downward sloping demand curve representing that we have this diminishing marginal benefit. As people buy more of something, their marginal benefit is declining. Now to someone who asked the question earlier, what if we have not just one individual, right? Because I am interested in one individual's demand curve, but if I'm a company and I am selling a specific product, I'm interested in the market as a whole, right? So how do I get what we call market demand? Well, we'll start out just very easy with 2 individuals, right? Let's assume we have a population of 2 people. The same principles would apply if we have millions, right? It just gets a little bit more cumbersome. But let's say we have 2 individuals. So instead of an individual demand curve, we want a market demand curve. So here, let's say I've got 2 individuals and they have slightly different demands. So here's these kind of different prices, right? And here's the quantity demanded of each individual. Excuse me. So who is going to value this good, the very first unit of this good, a little bit more? So if we look at a price of 6, how much is Zoolander willing to buy? So what must be true about his marginal benefit? It must be, well, the price is 6. That's the marginal cost. If I'm not buying it, that means my marginal benefit must be less than that. So I know that the marginal benefit of that very first unit must be less than 6. Well, what about for Ken? At $6, he's buying 5 of these drinks. So I know that the marginal benefit at the 5th unit is equal to what? Well, if I'm buying it, marginal cost, the price is 6. That means my marginal benefit must be greater than equal to, or generally we think about as soon as that price hits 6, I buy the 5th unit. So The marginal benefit of the fifth unit is 6. What would the marginal benefit of the first unit be? Even higher. So we know that in this example, Ken values this good, or the marginal benefit that Ken gets from consuming the very first few units of this good must be higher, right? Because he's willing to pay higher prices to buy these first 5 units. What does the price have to be for Zoolander to buy 5? Somewhere between 3 and 4, much lower, right? He's willing to pay a much lower value. Demand represents the ability and willingness to pay. So if I have these two individuals' demand curves, how would I get market demand? What's maybe an easy way to think about this? Just add them up, right? It's just not, we're not breaking the, the internet or anything here, right? If I just have individual demand curves, I know if I charge a price of $5, Zoolander will buy 2, Ken will buy 6. How many total am I selling? Or how many total do people want to buy? 8 at that price. So all we do to get our market demand curve is add up every individual's demand curve. Okay? That's not anything too crazy. Well, and I'll build this out for you here, just to kind of give a quick glimpse what we're doing before we look at the market demand curve. So if I'm looking at the quantity demanded and the price, before maybe this is like, I don't know, Zoolander's demand curve, and then maybe this was, forget some, Ken had a little bit higher value, right? So maybe Ken's was out here. How would I get my market demand curve? At every single price, I would just take how much each one of these individuals would buy and add them up. At every single price, how much would each one of these be willing to buy and add them up? Well, try to draw it kind of there. So here we can kind of think about in a 2 individual economy, my market demand curve, I'm always adding up the individual's demand curve. So my market demand curve is always going to be somewhere high, right? Or somewhere to the right. I'm going to think about it that way for right now. Okay. So all I'm doing to get market demand is adding up each individual's demand curve. Okay. I'm going to jump the gun a little bit to something we'll talk about later. But what's going to happen to market demand as I start to have more individuals in my economy? Huh? So for now, we'll think about, we're just keeping linear demand curves, right? In reality, there will be some curvature, yes, to it. But if I'm just thinking about if I have to get market demand by adding up each individual's demand curve, what's going to happen is if I just have more people, it's going to get larger and larger, right? Or move really far to the right. So before we even get to thinking about demand shifts, if I have more people in my economy, that represents that at the same price, if I'm charging $5 for this drink, I now not have 2 people buying it, I have 200. That means demand is going to be higher or lower? Higher. So when I'm drawing this, notice market demand, as I add more people, it's going to move further and further to the right. So what do rightward movements in the demand curve reflect? Higher demand or increases in demand. So if it helps to think about that through the fact that how are we coming up with market demand, we're adding up individual demand curves. Okay. So as we have more individuals, that just means that we must have more overall market demand. Okay. And that overall market demand being higher looks like a rightward shift in our demand curve. Okay. Any questions on that before? Yeah.
So, like, if there were more than 2 people in the department, how would you set up a player with like, you can't just like add all the together.
You can. If I have a big data set and I've got a good data management program, we're not going to do that in this class, right? I've just got different observations very quickly in Excel. I can add up a row, right? Or I can add up a column. So I can do it pretty quickly if I have the data. Now in practice, to your point, what do these companies probably try to do to estimate what demand is? Because I don't have every single individual's demand curve in this room, right? But what might I do? I might put out surveys to try to get an idea about what does the average consumer look like? Because every individual is going to have a different demand curve. But if I can figure out, well, what does the average consumer's demand curve look like by, say, putting out a survey to a couple hundred people? Well, then I just take that average demand and I say, well, what's market demand? Well, this is the average of every one person. And I know there's about 350 million people in my economy. Just multiply that by 350 million. So in practice, yes, we would come up with like what is one representative demand curve? But we're still essentially adding that up, however many people that we would have. What is that doing? Well, it's just multiplying. But yeah, that's the same process, right? The math just looks a little bit different. Yep. Any other questions before we keep moving here? These are good. Okay. All right. So here's my market demand curve. Nothing really looks that much different. Once I add up the quantities at every single one of these prices, I kind of already showed you visually what that looks like. But if I have a market demand curve, I could also have a market demand schedule, right? It would just tell me at these various prices, what's the total market demand at these different prices. If I graph out this price and quantity demand, this would represent not my individual demand curve, but my market demand curve.
Have a graph, like it's like deeper, like flatter.
So it would get, right, this market demand curve, I drew it where it looked like parallel shifts. But if I have different consumers that have different slopes, what your market demand curve would show you, and I won't necessarily quiz you or test you on this, but the slope of your market demand curve will essentially be the average of the slopes of all the individuals in it. Does that, so once, because think about a very simple two-person example. If you have like a slope of -2 and -4, when I add those together, my market demand is going to have a slope of -3. It's always going to give me my average slope across the individuals in my economy. I'm not going to ask you what the slope of the market demand curve is, but that is the answer. Right? And that gets harder if we move away from linear demand curves, because now I've got like quadratics and I got to do a bunch of higher level math, and it's not fun. But for us, just if it helps to think about the market demand slope, it's really telling you kind of what the average slope would be across all the individuals that you've added up. Yep. Any other questions before we keep moving here? Okay. So I kind of already alluded to this, but if we have our demand curve, we're also going to talk about things that are going to shift this demand curve. Okay. So if I were to hold constant the price, so when we graph out this demand curve, that tells us the slope is telling us the relationship between the price and how much someone's willing or able to buy. Right? If I were to hold the price constant, right, there's other things that will shift that demand curve around. So for example, you might have some willingness and ability to pay in terms of buying those orange milk or frappuccinos. But if there's other things that change other than the price, you might buy less. If your income all of a sudden goes to 0, it doesn't matter that you were willing to pay more for that first drink than the second, because if you have an income of 0, how many are you going to buy? 0, right? So things like income or some of these other traits will shift our demand curve. It won't change the slope. That slope tells us that relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. However, where that demand curve is at, right, it will get shifted by a bunch of other factors. So some of these other factors, right, things that will shift the entire demand curve, we're going to kind of run through them, right? And I'll kind of show you what these demand curve shifts looks like. So before we talk about anything, well, I can do this. We'll kill 2 birds with 1 stone, right? So let's say I'm thinking about, there we go. What do I want here? Well, got a dumb example, but we can run with it. So let's say, bear with me for a second. All right. So if I had like my demand curve, and this is for dogs, right? This is like my wife's individual demand curve, although it's probably pretty flat as opposed to being steep. As you know, these dogs cost less and less, maybe I'd be willing to buy more, whatever the product is, right? If all of a sudden I have very little income, right? Even though I might be willing to kind of house more and more dogs, maybe I'm like in California, I'm taking in all these like, rescues. I'm taking in more or less depending on what the price of kind of bringing them in is. If I don't have any income, where is this demand curve going to be? No matter what the price, whatever number I was willing to buy before or house before, how many dogs can I now take in? Well, if I don't have any income, way less, right? So at every single price, that's going to be true. So if I have what we would call kind of normal goods, when people have less income or income decreases, what's that going to cause? Well, at every price, if I'm now buying less, that would be a demand. Not trying to trick you. If I buy less, that's a demand decrease, right? This would be what we think about as kind of normal goods. Okay. Now, what if I had an increase in my income? All of a sudden, I'm a millionaire. Well, for my wife, at every single price, you would now have way more dogs, right? So at every single price, if I'm now demanding more of this product, what's happening to my demand curve? Well, now when income goes up for a normal good, what's happening to demand? It's increasing. So this is why I set it up earlier, thinking about when we had more individuals, what happened to market demand? Market demand increased. Well, here we can actually analyze this at the individual level or the market level. If my entire economy has a higher level of income, what happens to the demand for most normal products? Demand increases. Same applies at the individual level. If any one individual has more income, what happens for most products? Their demand is going to increase.
Yeah, but that wouldn't really change like more benefit for yourself. Like you became a millionaire, you would still want to buy like a bunch more coffee, right? Like
yeah. So if you think about what the marginal benefit to the consumer is, I'll explain this in a way. So if I have what the demand curve tells us is the ability and willingness to pay. So that willingness to pay is, I think, what you're kind of focusing on is like what the actual benefit to you would be. Well, if I have more money, why might the benefit be higher to buying the same number as it was before? When I buy something, like going back to last week, there are always trade-offs. If I have more money, when I buy the same number of units, because I have more money, I don't have to give up buying as many, I don't have to give up as many other things. So my marginal benefit really is going to change because of my income. Because my income changes, to buy that same number, I don't have to give up buying as much as I did before when I had less income. Exactly, right? So it's kind of like how much am I benefiting? Well, my benefit kind of has caked into it what else I was giving up. So if you want to think about the marginal benefit we're measuring, it's kind of like the net benefit to the consumer of buying that product. Well, we'll talk about those in a second, jumping down. But yeah, for now, we'll think about kind of normal goods here. Luxury goods would be, we won't really talk about those, I don't think, until next week where we look at elasticities, right? For now, we just think about normal goods. Yep. Any other questions on this? So we'll kind of use this for all the other types of things we talk about shifting the demand curve. Decreases in demand look like leftward shifts. I don't use the word upward and downward because it gets a little bit trickier once we get to supply. But, you know, you can kind of think about like demand decreasing is a leftward or a downward shift. Increases in demand looks like it's a rightward or an upward shift. I just don't like to use upward and downward because once we get to demand, or sorry, once we get to supply, those can trick you to think of it that way. So always think about increases, starting with demand, we'll eventually get to supply. Increases in either of those things would be shifts to the right. Decreases in either of those things, supply or demand, would be shifts to the left. So I'm always going to draw kind of left and rightward arrows just to kind of avoid that confusion once we get to supply.
the demand curve, both variables change with each other.
Yeah, so this is representing that at that same you can think of it two ways. At the same price, I'm willing to now buy more, right? When I have more money. At the same price, if I have less money, I'm willing to buy less. Okay? So yeah, these two things are going to kind of move together if you want to think about the whole demand curve is shifted. We're not going to worry about changes in the slope. There in practice, yes, but that would be like the next level of microeconomics. Yep. Okay. All right. So we've got our increases and decreases in demand. I kind of have them in the slides, but I think sometimes, drawing it out, showing you different points makes it a little bit easier. So anytime I have a leftward shift in demand, that's a decrease. Anytime I have a rightward shift in demand, that means that every price I'm going to see an increase. So we've got our increases, decreases in demand. We're going to go through the other things. I've already kind of talked about this one. If I have more buyers, is that going, so if I have more people in my market, is that going to increase or decrease my demand curve? Increase, right? How did we get market demand? We added up all the individual demand curves. So if I have more individuals, I'm going to have a higher market demand. So this is why, I'm always trying to add more people. If I add a third person, right, what's going to happen to my market demand curve? Well, at every single price, I now have a third person who is willing to buy some of this product. So as soon as I start adding more people to my economy, the entire demand curve is going to shift to the right. So this might explain, if I'm thinking about the market for an individual good, if you watch any TV show or anything, what do you always have to force to watch? Even YouTube. Ads. What are those trying to do? Increase the number of consumers. Yes, maybe to my company specifically, but just to the product in general, right? As a company, I like it when demand is higher. We won't know why yet, but we'll get there next class. Okay. So more individuals, increase in our demand curve. So if I'm a company in the US, why might I be concerned about birth rates? Anyone knows what birth rates are right now? It's below us, a really important number. So if the birth rate is 2, that means that we're doing what? Exactly replacing ourselves. So the birth rate in the US is now below 2. That means that the population is going bad thing. If I'm worried about selling things, that means demand is going to be decreasing, right? And just in terms of the number of buyers, right? There's other things that will impact the demand curve we'll talk about in a second, but just the number of buyers, I might be concerned. Okay. We already talked about normal goods, right? So this is going to be typical goods that you would think about: clothing, new cars. What did I put up here? Computers. Really, most products we buy are normal goods. When we have more money, what happens to demand? Increases. We have less money. What do we demand? Less of that product. This is most goods. Okay. And the shifts work the exact same way as what we were drawing before. Okay. Now, what if I have an inferior goods, right? So what examples do I have here? I used to use ramen noodles. Some people really like ramen and they would raise their hand and be like, no, I'd buy more ramen if I had more money. Okay. Let's use public transportation, right? Now I'll even go one further. Let's think about private jets, right? Or actually, no, that won't work. Let's do public transportation, and I'll come back to private jets for a later example. So public transportation, things like buses in Bloomington, right? If you have more money, what might you be more likely to buy? Your own car. In which case, how much do you demand public transportation? Not as much. So there are some products that we call inferior products. When I have more money, I start to use them less and less. Here's my example. I said private jets. That's not the inferior good. If I think about commercial airlines, right? If I have more and more money, what do really wealthy individuals start to do? Not fly commercial, private. So what is a commercial airline? It's an inferior good. When I see increases in income, right? Eventually I start to buy less of that product. Now, for most of us, are we ever going to get to the point where it becomes an inferior good? Probably not, right? But for some individual demand curves, it might be inferior. In fact, this is where for different individuals, different goods can be inferior or they can be normal. So for example, for me, when I didn't have a lot of money, I found really innovative ways to make meals out of canned tuna, right? Because it's very cheap. Now that I have enough money to afford higher quality meat products, I don't buy canned tuna, right? There is people like my mom loves to make tuna sandwich. It doesn't matter if she was dirt poor or if she was a millionaire. She probably would still make herself, some tuna salad sandwich or something. So for any one individual, some goods could be inferior or normal. So when we talk about what goods are normal and inferior, we're kind of talking about like on average, right? And I try to use examples that like for most people, I would say public transportation is an inferior good. If you view public transportation as a normal good, you are a psychopath, right? If you like being on a public bus, you might have some issues, right? So I'll try to use these examples that kind of apply to most people, but really we're talking about like the average. Okay? My other example, not that any of you would have any idea about this, but I used to drink Natty Light or Natty Ice all the time. As soon as I actually had a job, I'm now drinking things like Sun King beers, right? Higher quality beers. What was Natty Light for me? When I had more money, I didn't buy more of it. I actually bought less of it, so it would be an inferior goods. So another thing you can think about for inferior goods, usually it's like lower quality goods tend to be inferior, right? I might buy, when I don't have as much money, I might buy a lot more things from Shein than I would when I actually have some money. I can go get some higher quality products, right? So those are my examples to make it make sense. Where are we at in time? So I want to get through these. So we save enough time next class. So let's think about couple other things that will shift our demand curve. So substitute goods, right? So anytime the price of a substitute good goes up, that's actually going to increase the demand curve of the other product that is a substitute for it. So the example I'll kind of use and kind of think about, let's say, this isn't really the case as much now. When I was younger, a desktop computer actually used to be not as expensive as like a laptop. Laptops were really expensive. As the price of laptop computers fell, what happened to the demand for a desktop computer? How many of you own a desktop computer? A handful, right? It used to be that the majority of people had a desktop computer, but not a laptop. So when the price of laptops started to fall because of technology advancements, what happened to the demand for desktop computers? It also fell, right? So when the two goods are substitutes, when the price of one good goes down, I'll buy less of the other, or said differently, when the price of the other good goes up, I'll buy more of the other. If you go into a restaurant and they were going to charge you $2 for a thing of Coke, but $5 for a thing of Pepsi, you might have some weird allegiance to Pepsi over Coke. To me, it's really all the same product. So if I'm going in there and they're trying to charge me a higher price for Pepsi, what am I more likely to do? Buy the substitute good. So when the price of the substitute good goes up, the other good, the other product, we see the demand for that increase as well, even if the price doesn't change, right? When the price of the other related good, the substitute good goes up, we see a shift in the entire demand curve. Complementary goods, these are a little bit weird thing about, everyone always likes to use like peanut butter jelly and like bagels and cream cheese and like things that most people consume together. I don't know why economists are focused so much on food. I think what makes a lot more sense is think about things like gasoline and SUVs, because SUVs get pretty bad for the most part miles per gallon. So we're thinking about gasoline powered SUVs here. I have to, in order to drive my SUV, if it's not electric, I need gas. I cannot use that product without the other. So gasoline and gasoline powered SUVs, those are what we call complementary goods. I can't use my SUV without gasoline. So if the price of gasoline goes up, what do you think happens to the demand for gasoline powered SUVs? People are less likely to want to buy them, right? Because in order to use that SUV, it's now going to cost me more money. I'll go back when it's not my current car, another one died, but I used to have this car. When I was thinking about buying a car, this was about 10, 15 years ago, diesel was almost like $1 cheaper than unleaded gasoline. So I ended up getting a Volkswagen diesel car. Why? Because when I looked at that, I said, well, if I drive this car and I buy this car, I have to have gas or I have to have diesel. If the price of diesel is lower, was I more likely to buy that car? Yes. And so I actually did, right? It influenced my demand for that product because the complementary good to it, the price was lower. So if we look at like a bunch of data, when gasoline prices are like higher or lower, what do we expect to see happen to the sales of things like low mile per gallon SUVs? Well, when gasoline prices are high, what do you think happens to the amount of SUVs we see purchased? Lower, right? So complementary goods, they work in opposite directions. Okay. We got 15 minutes. Let me see where we're at. Okay, I think we can get through this and I'll kind of go through something here. So this one isn't anything crazy. It works the exact same way as our income changes. if consumers, it's just, we want to start to talk about expectations because it gets a little bit weird, right? So if I think I'm gonna have more money in the future, what might I do today? So you guys all probably think you're gonna have more money 4 or 5 years from now, right? So what do people do if they think they're gonna have more money in the future? I might take out a loan and buy more things today. So what happens to normal goods if I expect to have more money in the future? Demand would increase. If I expect to have less money in the future, what might I do today? If I think I'm going to lose my job because the economy sucks, what might I start? Yeah, I might start tightening my belt, not, really pinching pennies at the grocery store because I might buy less because I'm thinking I'm not going to have as much. I act today as though I already have less income. So income expectations work the exact same way as if I actually had more or had less income. Okay? So normal and inferior goods, that relationship would stay the same with income expectations. No difference there. Okay? Now, what gets a little bit trickier is not income expectations, whoops, but price expectations. So I'll kind of show you as we start to look through more of these models. I'll use a little bit more shorthand. So let's say I've got a good, and I expect that the price is going to be higher tomorrow, right? So think about, this is my price expectation, right? What's going to happen to my current demand or my demand today? If I think prices are going to be higher tomorrow, what might I try to do today? Buy more today, right? If I read some article about the price of eggs is about to skyrocket, I might run to the grocery store today and buy eggs. So with price expectations, this actually looks like it goes against the law of demand, but it's not. The law of demand talks about current prices and the current quantity demanded, right? Here we're saying changes in price expectation don't shift my demand curve, or sorry, don't change where I'm at on my demand curve. Price expectations actually shift the entire curve, right? Regardless of what the price is today, if I think the price is going to be higher tomorrow, I'm going to buy more today, right? And then vice versa, right? So it looks like it goes against the law of demand, but that's not going against the law of demand. Our demand curve is still downward sloping. It's just that when we expect higher prices tomorrow, we might buy more at every price today. So it's an actual shift in our demand curve. But the demand curve is still downward sloping, representing the relationship between, you can kind of think about the current prices, right, and current quantity demand.
We also oppose like quantity, like in COVID, that like everyone's buying like orange and stuff. Even if like the price stays the same, like there's gonna be a higher demand for that.
So that wouldn't be price expectations necessarily, right? Unless you thought about, if you thought the price of like masks was going to skyrocket, maybe you bought more really early on. You can have market expectations as well. Like if you think, we don't go through those because like income expectations and price expectations apply to every market. Every market is going to have its own expectations. So like, for example, the market for asphalt probably changes a lot depending on what they think the weather is going to be in the winter. Because when it's particularly bad winters, like even what we have right here, what happens as soon as it's spring, they've got to go fill in a bunch of potholes, right? So there are different types of goods where there will be expectations that matter. We just don't go into those because every market's going to look a little bit different, right? Even the market for education, right? I might think that there's more opportunities available now to individuals that wouldn't need a college degree. And so maybe as a result, I think the demand for higher education might be going down. But that's specific to the market that we're, yeah. So these are going to be more generalized. We'll talk about more generalized expectations. But yes, every market is going to have different expectations that could influence that demand curve as well. Yep. Any other questions on that before we keep moving? And kind of to that point, I have this thrown in here, and you won't see a lot of questions on this because it really is specific to every individual, right? But there's tastes and preferences in any market that cause the demand curve to shift that a lot of the times we can't even anticipate, right? Like when fidget spinners were a thing, like how? right? Like, why was the demand higher? It was just some fad. You go back far enough, like the 90s, the Atkins diet was like a big thing. So I think it prescribes like eggs, bacon, eating like a lot of fats and proteins. So a lot of products that met that diet, we saw increases in demand. That doesn't fall under any of our other categories. It's just these weird things that can sometimes shift our demand curve to the point every market, there's going to be different factors that influence just that one market. Those aren't as interesting for us because A, they're hard to anticipate, but also B, we want to talk about things that we can generalize to all markets, right? I guess if I'm an expert and I really want to understand why people demand pet rocks, maybe I focus on that, but it doesn't probably give me a lot of power to say much else about other goods. Yeah. All right. Any other questions before we get moving here? All right, so I might have taken a little bit more time, but I think that's okay. I want to go here, and it should already be published. Some of you might have already jumped into it. We'll talk through it though. Sometimes this is where I'm nice. Should be pretty quick and easy. So I'll kind of run through these with you. So let's assume I've got ramen noodles and they're inferior good. So even though I'm going through these with you, we still need to submit it before we leave class today. Okay. So I believe I've got it set to be due at the end of class. So in the next, 9 minutes. Let me just double check that's what I have. Yep. So in the next 9 minutes, make sure you're getting this submitted. Okay. So if I have an inferior good and I see that the average income in the US is going down. So inferior goods, when income decreases, what's going to happen to our demand curve? Which way is it going to shift? Is it going to increase or decrease? When I have less money for inferior goods, I would actually buy more of them. Inferior goods were the ones that like low quality. So when I have less income, I'm more likely to be renting than buying my own home. I'm more likely to be buying ramen noodles as opposed to going out to a 5-star restaurant. Okay? So this inferior good, when we have less money, I'm actually going to buy more of it. So an increase in demand, I said we want to think about increases as right or leftward shifts. Rightward shifts. So my answer there would be what? What's a rightward shift? Yeah, A. Kind of going from 1 to 2, we'll start using this notation like 1 is where we start out, 2 is where we are after the change. When I'm writing it, I might write old and new, but the numbers that I kind of use notationally will be like 1 and 2. Okay. What's the second question we've got here? So let's say I'm running with my ramen noodle example for some reason today. So what happens to the demand curve for ramen noodles if the price of ramen noodles decreases? Well, what tells us the relationship between the price and the demand for a specific product? So that's not going to be a shift. That was actually our demand curve. The demand curve told us the relationship between the price of that good and how much was being demanded, or the quantity demanded. So when I see a change in the price of a good, that's not going to be a shift in my curve, right? The only thing that shifted my curve was things that were changing other than the price of that specific good. The prices of other goods, income, right? We said the price of substitutes, complements, right? Income expectations, all these other things that were changing shifted the demand curve, but the actual price of the good just move us to different points on that curve. So when the price of ramen noodles decreases, I'm just moving to a different point or a different quantity demanded on that same demand curve. Okay. So changes in the price of a good just move us along that curve. Changes in anything else is what caused these shifts. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? So that's going to be what? C. All right. Now I've got SpaghettiOs, ramen noodles. All right. So if you don't know what SpaghettiOs are, they're like really terrible for you food that's in a can. They're like, I don't even know, tomato sauce and then noodles or something. But let's assume they're substitutes for consumers. People either eat ramen or they might have a can of SpaghettiOs, right? If the price of SpaghettiOs all of a sudden plummets, you can kind of think about it this way. With substitute goods, if I go into the store and I could buy either one of these products,
when one of them is cheaper, am I more or less likely to buy that good? So I'm more likely to buy that good, which means that the other product I am less likely to buy. So when the price of SpaghettiOs is lower, what would happen to the demand for ramen noodles? It would decrease, right? What does a decrease in demand look like? We said decreases we are going to think about as leftward shifts. Increases were rightward shifts. So here, this would cause a decrease in demand or a leftward shift here. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Yeah, so if we ever have a change in the price of a good, that's not going to shift our demand curve. That's just moving us to a different point on that. So when the price of the good decreases that we're looking at, we're just moving to a different point. All right, before you get packed up and get out of here, I want to cover what we didn't get to last week, which I think is all the way down here. And I kind of have this equation for growth rate. This kind of applies to an economy as a whole, but I also like to try to give you things that I think will be helpful to you in life. So if we're looking at GDP and we're thinking about economies have growth rates, and one of the questions on the last quiz, I think, was how do we increase growth? Well, that was the idea that we don't want to spend money on consumption goods. We want to invest into capital funds, right? So if I can get a certain growth rate, why do I like that as an economy? Well, because my GDP will grow by 1 plus whatever that growth rate is, and then to the power of however many years out I'm trying to make my projection. So if I know the number of years out I'm trying to predict what GDP will be, I can take my current GDP, multiply by 1 plus whatever I think the growth rate will be. So growth rates of like 5%, we would use these in decimal form, so it would be like 0.05. And then take that to the power of whatever number of years. So there's some general rules of thumb. I have this Excel example kind of linked, but I define this a little bit different. I think it might be interesting for you guys, especially how many of you are, well, I'm not asking you to raise your hand. I imagine many of you have taken out student loans or are thinking about taking out loans. I just wanted to kind of show you the power of interest rates, right? So why do people get all crazy, or why is the news always talking about interest rates, right? Even this is interest rates on loans, on homes, new homes. Well, because I can use that equation where I take the amount that I invested, that was like my old GDP, multiply that by 1 plus whatever this growth rate is. Well, we can think about in an economy, the growth rate is how much our economy is growing. An interest rate is how much your loan is growing, right? It's the same concept. So I'll then take that to the power of however many years out I'm trying to project that this is going to be. So for example, if I were to take out a loan, and let's say it was only $1 to make the point, if the interest rate is 2%, if I don't pay it off in 10 years, it's only going to be $1.20. But if that interest rate is 10%, in 10 years, that same dollar, I now have to pay back $2.60. So you can think about, you're not taking out $1, even if I'm kind of modest with my student loans of $10,000. I mean, that starts to be, you're talking about interest rate differences of just 2% here. Over 10 years, that's $2,000, almost $3,000 here, right? So this idea of compounding interest, right, is the same thing as when we're trying to do these GDP growth rates, right? That even small changes in the growth rate, even small changes in the interest rate over time can have huge impacts. In fact, for economies, we're not trying to project out for the next 10 years. I might want to know where am I going to be at in the next 35. Notice if I have a 2% versus a 4% growth rate, we may not think of that as very large. But where's our economy at in 35 years? Almost twice as large, right? With that very small difference in growth rate. So small difference in growth rates, small difference in interest rates can cause very large differences when we're trying to make predictions for future, down 30 years out. Okay. So before you leave, make sure you're hitting submit on that quiz. It's meant to be in class, so it's set to be 9:15. So get that submitted before you leave. Other than that, we'll pick up where we left off on Thursday. See you then.